It is the summer of 1994. Inside the sleek glass towers of Citibank in New York City, executives and system operators are staring at screens in disbelief. Money is vanishing. Millions of dollars, not in bags carried by armed men, not from safes blown open with dynamite, but quietly, invisibly, as numbers shift inside Citibank's computers. One moment the funds are there, and the next, gone. Rerouted halfway across the world. There are no alarms ringing, no broken locks, no security guards chasing thieves down Wall Street. Instead, the robbery is happening in silence, carried out from thousands of miles away, through nothing more than a phone line and a modem. Someone has found a way to rob a bank without ever setting foot inside it. For generations, the idea of a bank robbery was almost cinematic. Masks, getaway cars, shouting tellers, maybe a bloody shootout. But here, in the dawn of the internet age, Citibank finds itself victim to something entirely new. Crime without a face. Behind the chaos stands a name that would soon make headlines worldwide. Vladimir Levin, a Russian hacker from St. Petersburg, allegedly directing accomplices scattered across the globe. He wasn't armed with guns or explosives. His weapons were mathematics, code, and a telephone line. The newspapers at the time were quick to dramatize it. The hacker who robbed Citibank, the bank robbery of the future. But for investigators, there was nothing sensational about it. This was a nightmare. How do you chase a thief who doesn't leave footprints, who doesn't even exist in the same country? The FBI scrambled to keep up. This was unfamiliar territory. They had no cybercrime division yet, no roadmap for prosecuting someone who could sit in his apartment in St. Petersburg and, with a few keystrokes, move millions from Manhattan to Tel Aviv. The scale was staggering. Over 40 fraudulent transfers were initiated, nearly $10 million rerouted through accounts in the US, Finland, Israel, the Netherlands. Some of the funds were withdrawn in cash. Others froze mid-transfer. But all of it proved one thing. The digital frontier was wide open, and banks had left the door unlocked. And for Citibank executives, the timing could not have been worse. The early 1990s were a period of transformation. Financial institutions were rushing into the digital age, embracing new services that allowed corporations to manage accounts remotely. Dial-up access, secure passwords, convenience at the touch of a button. It was supposed to be the future of banking. Instead, it became their Achilles heel. The story of Vladimir Levin is not just about one hacker or one crime. It is about the moment when the world realized that money, information, and trust could all be stolen without the sound of shattering glass. What unfolded over the next 3 years would span continents, test international law, and force the FBI, Scotland Yard, and Interpol to cooperate in ways they had never done before. It would expose the fragility of early cybersecurity and show how even the most powerful banks in the world could be humbled by one man and a machine. Tonight, we're diving deep into the case of Vladimir Levin, the man accused of pulling off the first online bank robbery in history. We'll trace how he allegedly breached Citibank's systems, how his accomplices tried to convert stolen digits into real dollars, how a global manhunt finally cornered him, and why his surprisingly light sentence left many wondering if the true story was much bigger than the headlines. But first, we need to understand the world that made this crime possible, the fragile, chaotic ecosystem of the early internet and a post-Soviet Russia where opportunity and desperation collided. That is where our story begins. To understand how Vladimir Levin could reach across continents and pluck millions from Citibank, we need to step back into the early 1990s, an era when banks were experimenting with something that felt futuristic, almost science fiction at the time: remote access. Citibank was among the pioneers. They wanted their corporate clients, big firms moving money around the globe, to be able to check balances, authorize transfers, and manage accounts without ever walking into a branch. The solution? a dial-up connection. If you had a personal computer, a modem, and the right phone number, you could plug in and connect directly to Citibank's systems. For businesses, it was revolutionary. No more faxes, no more waiting for branch hours, no more calling in requests. Banking at the speed of the new digital age. But convenience came at a price. The system's defenses were primitive, even by the standards of the day. Security meant little more than a personal identification number, a code that, once stolen, was effectively a master key. There was no sophisticated encryption, no multi-factor authentication, no real firewalls. The idea of cybersecurity barely existed. Citibank's executives were more worried about selling the promise of speed and innovation than about closing vulnerabilities no one had yet imagined. And it worked. Until it didn't. While New York bankers congratulated themselves on their shiny new digital network, halfway around the world, Russia was living in a very different reality. The Soviet Union had collapsed just a few years earlier, and the country was thrown into chaos. Hyperinflation devoured savings, industries collapsed, and millions of people who had once lived under rigid state control were now scrambling to survive in a free-for-all economy. The vacuum left by the state was quickly filled by others. The Russian mafia, black market traders, and hustlers of every variety thrived. It was a Darwinian world, fast, brutal, and endlessly inventive. If you were clever, unscrupulous, and bold, the 1990s in Russia offered 1,000 new ways to get rich. It was in this environment that Vladimir Levin came of age. Levin was not, at least on paper, what you would expect from a super hacker. He wasn't a trained computer scientist or a prodigy from some secret Soviet tech program. He had studied microbiology of all things. A man of science, but not of circuits. Yet, like so many restless minds of that era, he was drawn to the new and mysterious world of computers and the internet. Friends and later investigators would describe him as quiet, intelligent, and methodical. Not a flashy criminal mastermind, but someone who understood systems, and who saw opportunity where others saw only abstract code. Levin's exact role has always been debated. Was he the genius who cracked Citibank's system himself? Or was he a middleman, the coordinator of a team that had already found a weakness? Whatever the truth, one fact is certain. He was the face of the operation, the man who had come to symbolize this new, almost invisible breed of criminal. But Levin did not act alone. To turn stolen digits into cash, he needed people on the ground. Money mules, who could access the funds once they were rerouted into foreign accounts. Among those names were Evygeny and Ekaterina Korolkova, a husband and wife team who would later surface in the investigation. Their role was simple, but risky. Withdraw the money and make it disappear. Some withdrawals happened in Tel Aviv, others in San Francisco, Helsinki, Rotterdam. Always in cash, always fast, always under the radar. The Korolkovas and others like them were essential links in the chain, the bridge between the virtual heist and the real world. Without them, the crime would have remained just a collection of numbers on a screen. Citibank, for its part, had never truly imagined this scenario. To the executives who had championed dial-up banking, the threat wasn't hackers, it was competition. The race was about who could offer the most seamless experience, the fastest service, the flashiest innovation. Security, in their eyes, was a footnote. That oversight set the stage for Vladimir Levin and his accomplices. They weren't breaking through steel doors. They weren't tunneling into vaults. They were slipping through a crack no one had bothered to seal. And in the mid-1990s, that crack was wide enough to drive millions of dollars straight through. In the spring of 1994, the robbery began. There was no midnight break-in, no blueprints spread across a kitchen table, no masks or crowbars. Instead, somewhere in St. Petersburg, Russia, Vladimir Levin sat in front of a beige computer, a phone line crackling as his modem dialed across continents. With a few beeps and static bursts, he was inside Citibank's electronic nervous system. The bank had built its cash management platform to be fast and convenient. Levin saw something else. a door barely locked, waiting for someone bold enough to push. Authentication was nothing more than stolen PIN codes and account details. Once you had those, you weren't a stranger anymore. You were a customer. And Levin had them. Using those codes, he initiated transfer after transfer, moving funds out of Citibank's secure accounts and into ones that his associates had quietly opened around the world. Israel, the Netherlands, Finland, across the United States. By the time he was finished, more than 40 separate transfers had been ordered. Nearly $10 million was set in motion, not as stacks of bills hauled in duffel bags, but as streams of digits, silently skipping across networks that most people still didn't understand. It should have been flawless. It should have been the perfect crime. But like all ambitious heists, reality was messier. Some of the transfers triggered alarms. Bank clerks spotted discrepancies, froze accounts, flagged activity. Other transfers went through but got stuck downstream, caught in bureaucratic nets before Levin's accomplices could reach the cash. And some of the mules, the people meant to walk into banks and withdraw the money, were sloppy, nervous, or unlucky. That's where Evgeny and Ekaterina Korolkova entered the picture again. Married, ordinary in appearance, they became Levin's couriers in the West. They would walk into banks in Tel Aviv or San Francisco, check an account, and attempt to withdraw tens of thousands at a time. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and sometimes, without knowing it, they were walking under the quiet gaze of federal agents. The FBI had begun to monitor suspicious withdrawals linked back to Citibank. By the time the Korolkovas reached certain branches, investigators were already trailing them. Each failed withdrawal, each frozen account, became another thread pulling the Bureau closer to the shadowy figure in Russia. Meanwhile, Levin remained thousands of miles away, directing operations like a chess player moving digital pawns across a global board. His tools were not crowbars or guns, but phone lines and keystrokes. He never touched the money himself, never set foot in the banks he was robbing. He didn't need to. The 1990s network did the heavy lifting for him. But back in New York, Citibank executives were in freefall. They had built a reputation on trust and stability, and now millions were simply vanishing, slipping out of the vault, not through the front door, but through invisible wires. Internal memos described anomalies, transfers that made no sense. Screens showed accounts suddenly drained, only to have the numbers reappear when a freeze order took hold. Panic spread through the offices. Money is vanishing, one insider later recalled, and we don't know how. It was, quite literally, the first time a major American bank realized it was being robbed by someone with no mask, no gun, and no getaway car. Just a modem. For Citibank, the nightmare wasn't just the money. It was what the money represented. If one Russian hacker could do this, what would stop others? What if this became the new normal? Could customers ever trust that their digital balances were safe, that their virtual dollars weren't just illusions ready to disappear at the whim of some faceless stranger overseas? Levin kept dialing, kept probing, kept shifting funds. The Korolkovas and other mules kept trying to turn those digits into crisp bills. The FBI kept tightening its net. The stage was set for a collision. The invisible robber in Russia, the desperate mules abroad, and the first major test of law enforcement's ability to fight crime in a world where the front line was no longer the vault door, but the phone line. Citibank had seen theft before, embezzlement, fraud, even armed robbery. But this was different. The money wasn't slipping into a briefcase under a teller's nose. It was evaporating through invisible wires, carried away by signals most executives barely understood. The moment the scope of the theft became clear, Citibank made a call. The FBI had to be brought in. And when the Bureau's cyber division took a first look, they knew they were standing at the edge of something unprecedented. There was no getaway car to chase, no fingerprints to dust, no bank cameras to review. What they had instead were anomalies in transfer logs, suspicious phone numbers, and modem connection trails that stretched across oceans. This was the first major cyberbank robbery in U.S. history. Investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing Levin's digital footprints. Each fraudulent transfer left behind a trace, a timestamp, a dial-in point, a routing number. Phone companies were subpoenaed for records of long-distance modem calls. Slowly, a picture emerged, a hub of suspicious connections pointing towards St. Petersburg. But a name was harder to find. For weeks, the FBI chased data that seemed to dissolve the closer they looked. Then came the break. Citibank accounts abroad were being tapped for withdrawals. Money that Levin had shifted digitally was about to become tangible cash. And the people doing the legwork weren't shadowy masterminds behind a screen. They were flesh-and-blood couriers walking into banks. The FBI's San Francisco field office wasn't exactly built for this kind of case. In 1994, there was no cyber squad, no unit dedicated to digital crime. Instead, the Citibank anomaly landed on the desks of a white-collar crime squad. Special Agent Andrew Black remembered it vividly, because some of the stolen Citibank funds had been funneled into accounts in San Francisco. The names on those accounts? Evygeny and Ekaterina Korolkova, a young Russian couple who kept an apartment in the city. The trail led to a bank branch, where Ekaterina herself attempted a withdrawal. But by then, the FBI had already frozen the account. She walked away empty-handed, and agents followed her back to the apartment. What they found was the scene of a hurried escape. Suitcases lined the hallway, clothes stuffed hastily into bags. On the counter, a one-way ticket to Russia. When Special Agent Black and an FBI interpreter knocked on her door, she didn't resist. The game was up. She was arrested on the spot, her flight out of the U.S. canceled before it began. But her husband wasn't there. Evygeny Korolkov had already fled back to Russia, leaving his young wife behind to do the dirty work of withdrawing funds. The FBI feared he might vanish for good. Then came a twist. From inside federal custody, Ekaterina asked for a phone call. She reached her husband in Russia, and, according to Agent Black, what followed was not a tearful plea, but a tongue-lashing. In rapid-fire Russian, she read him the riot act, furious, demanding, commanding him to return. Whatever words she chose carried weight. Against all logic, Evygeny listened. He flew back to San Francisco, where FBI agents were waiting. He was arrested upon arrival. Like his wife, he quickly agreed to cooperate. Together, the Korolkovas provided key insights into how Levin's network moved stolen money through accounts and couriers. Their decision to flip gave investigators a vital link connecting the on-the-ground cash-outs to the mastermind across the ocean. The arrests in San Francisco marked a turning point. The faceless hacker was no longer a ghost in the wires. The FBI now had flesh-and-blood accomplices, and a trail leading straight back to Vladimir Levin. But knowing who he was didn't mean catching him would be easy. Levin was in St. Petersburg, beyond the reach of American law. Russia in the 1990s was chaotic, its institutions weakened by the fall of the Soviet Union. The legal system was murky, unreliable. Cybercrime wasn't even clearly defined under international treaties. To complicate matters further, many in Russia saw hackers less as criminals and more as symbols of ingenuity in a country still struggling with poverty and disorder. For the FBI, Levin might as well have been hiding on the moon. But investigators were patient. Working with Citibank and Interpol, they devised a plan. If Levin couldn't be touched in Russia, he had to be drawn out. And in 1995, an opportunity appeared. Levin was lured to London. Accounts differ on why. Some say it was for a supposed business meeting, others that he was promised access to more lucrative deals. Whatever the bait, Levin took it. At Heathrow Airport, as he stepped off a flight from Moscow, Scotland Yard was waiting. The arrest was quiet, clinical. No shootouts, no drama. Just a Russian hacker led away in handcuffs, bewildered by how far the FBI's reach had extended. But even with Levin in custody, the story was far from over. His lawyers quickly mounted a defense. He was a Russian citizen who had never set foot in the United States during the crime. How could American courts claim jurisdiction? The theft, they argued, was committed via phone lines in Russia. The fact that the money passed through U.S. accounts didn't mean Levin himself had crossed a border. For months, the case hovered in uncertainty. Legal scholars debated whether cyberspace had borders at all. Could a hacker in one country be prosecuted in another for keystrokes sent over a wire? The suspense deepened. Levin sat in a British jail, neither free nor yet delivered to the Americans. Citibank, meanwhile, kept the case as quiet as possible, desperate to reassure its clients that their money was safe, that this was a fluke and not the future. But the world was watching. For the first time, law enforcement wasn't just chasing a criminal across borders. They were chasing him across an entirely new dimension: cyberspace. Would Levin be extradited to face justice in the United States, or would he walk free thanks to jurisdictional gray zones? The answer would decide not only his fate, but the future of how the world prosecuted cybercrime. When Vladimir Levin was arrested at Heathrow Airport in 1995, the world of law enforcement entered uncharted waters. He wasn't a gunman caught fleeing a vault, or a con man nabbed with counterfeit bonds. He was a hacker, or at least accused of being one. And the FBI's challenge wasn't just proving his guilt, it was proving that they even had the right to put him on trial. Levin's lawyers wasted no time. Their argument was simple. He had never set foot in the United States. Every keystroke, every phone call, every transfer had originated in Russia. How could American courts claim authority over something that happened thousands of miles away? To many, it was a compelling defense. After all, Levin was a Russian citizen, operating from Russian soil. Shouldn't Russia try him, if anyone? But prosecutors saw it differently. The money had flowed through U.S. banks. The victims were in America. The damage was done in America. That, they insisted, was enough. The legal wrangling dragged on for months. Britain found itself caught in the middle, with Levin sitting in a London jail, while governments argued over borders that cyberspace seemed to erase. In the end, the U.S. won. Levin was extradited, flown across the Atlantic, and delivered into the hands of federal marshals. The case now moved to Brooklyn, where the stage was set for one of the first true cybercrime trials in American history. By 1997, the case had captured headlines around the globe. Reporters packed the courtroom, sketch artists sharpened their pencils, and federal prosecutors prepared to make an example of the man branded the hacker who robbed Citibank. But the trial was not as dramatic as many expected. Levin, pale and reserved, often appeared less like a criminal mastermind and more like a weary graduate student. He did not swagger. He did not taunt. He simply sat, listening intently as lawyers debated whether he had orchestrated one of the boldest financial crimes of the decade, or whether he was merely a cog in a larger machine. The government painted him as the architect of the heist, a man who had probed Citibank's systems, spotted weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. But Levin himself resisted that narrative. In the end, Levin chose not to fight the full weight of the evidence. He entered a plea agreement. He admitted to one count of conspiracy to defraud, a serious crime, yes, but far less than the original charges implied. Standing before the court, he acknowledged involvement, but insisted he had not been the mastermind. Others, he suggested, had orchestrated much of the scheme. He was, in his words, just one part of something larger. For many watching, the plea left a hollow taste. If Levin wasn't the ringleader, who was? And why weren't they on trial? When the sentence came down, jaws tightened across the courtroom. 3 years in prison, restitution of $240,000, compared to the nearly $10 million that had been siphoned, or at least attempted. It seemed almost laughably light. Citibank, for its part, claimed that all but $400,000 of the stolen funds had been recovered, thanks to rapid intervention and frozen accounts. But skeptics wondered if that figure told the whole story. For a crime that had rocked the financial world, The punishment seemed oddly modest. The lenient sentence fueled speculation. Had Levin taken the fall for a broader, organized group? Some investigators believed so, that he had been more of a frontman, while others, perhaps with ties to organized crime, pulled the real strings. Others whispered that Citibank itself had reasons to downplay the case. The last thing a major financial institution wanted in the mid-1990s, at the dawn of online banking, was mass panic about digital theft. The narrative of a lone hacker caught and punished was far cleaner and far less damaging than a messy international conspiracy. And so, with the case tied up neatly in court, many questions were quietly set aside. If the courtroom felt anticlimactic, the media made sure the story remained larger than life. Newspapers from New York to Moscow ran bold headlines. "The hacker who robbed Citibank. Millions stolen by keystroke. Banking in the age of the modem." For a public just waking up to the possibilities of the internet, the Levin case became a parable. Here was proof that the digital world was not only full of opportunity, but danger. That the money in your account could vanish without warning. That the smiling teller behind the counter was no longer your only line of defense. Levin himself served his time quietly. After his release, he faded from headlines, a shadow of his former notoriety. But his case lingered in memory, not because of who he was, but because of what his crime represented. 3 years behind bars, $240,000 paid back. That was the official record. But the real legacy of the trial was something far greater. A wake-up call for banks, governments, and anyone who believed that walls and vaults were enough to protect money. Levin's case proved otherwise. It showed the world that in the new age, the greatest bank robber might not carry a gun at all. He might carry only a modem. When Vladimir Levin finished his prison sentence in the late 1990s, he was immediately deported from the United States and slipped out of public view. Reporters tried to track him. Some claimed he moved abroad, perhaps Israel, perhaps somewhere in Eastern Europe. Others whispered he returned quietly to Russia, living under a different name. But while Levin disappeared, the case he left behind reverberated through the halls of finance. Citibank executives, who once downplayed the theft as a contained incident, began pouring resources into cybersecurity. Other banks took note. Before Levin, online banking was treated as a convenience feature, a modern upgrade to attract clients. Security was an afterthought. After Levin, it became clear. A few lines of code could be more dangerous than a safecracker's dynamite. The industry scrambled. Encryption became standard. Firewalls evolved from primitive barriers into sophisticated gatekeepers. Intrusion detection systems, once niche, became must-haves for any institution daring to digitize. In many ways, the modern architecture of cybersecurity was born in the shadow of a quiet Russian hacker and a Citibank panic. Levin's case also rippled through the legal world. Law schools dissected it as the first landmark example of transnational cybercrime. FBI training manuals referenced it as a blueprint. How to follow digital trails across borders, how to negotiate with reluctant foreign partners, how to argue jurisdiction in a world where geography meant less than a modem connection. It was no longer science fiction. Cybercrime was real, and the law had to evolve. In Russia, the Levin case became less of a cautionary tale and more of a harbinger. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left a generation of mathematicians, engineers, and programmers underemployed and restless. Many, like Levin, turned their skills toward technology. Some followed legitimate paths, others did not. By the 2000s, Eastern European hackers would dominate headlines. Mass credit card thefts, phishing rings, ransomware attacks. Levin may not have intended it, but his crime was the opening chapter of a much larger story. The rise of a cyber underworld with Russia often at its center. For Citibank, The episode was a nightmare narrowly contained. Nearly $10 million had been at risk. Public trust could have evaporated overnight. Yet, thanks to quick intervention, international cooperation, and, yes, luck, most of the money was recovered. The damage was reputational, not catastrophic. Still, executives never forgot how close they had come to disaster. In boardrooms across Wall Street, Levin's name became shorthand for a chilling thought. What if we aren't prepared next time? In the end, the Citibank heist was never just about money. It was about trust. Trust that banks could safeguard assets. Trust that technology could be embraced without fear. Trust that the digital future was secure. Levin shattered that trust, if only briefly, and forced the world to confront a new reality. The age of crime without borders had arrived. Picture it not as a Wild West gunman or a ski-masked robber bursting through a bank's door. Instead, imagine a dim apartment in St. Petersburg. A single man hunched over a beige computer. A modem hums and crackles with the sound of connection. With nothing more than keystrokes, he reaches across oceans, through satellites and wires, into the vaults of New York. No mask, no gun, just a modem. And with that hum, the world entered a new era. And now, my friends, I want to ask a question. Do you think Vladimir Levin's sentence was truly fair? Or was it kept low just for Citibank's convenience? If this story of cybercrime intrigued you and you'd like to hear more forgotten crimes from world history, let me know in the comments. Which case should we dive into next? And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next journey into true crime's darkest corners.